the Japanese had landed in Papua and established themselves at the eastern end of the one track which leads across the island to Port Moresby.
The enemy has brought us into the war right on our own shore.
The Kokoda Track Campaign was a land campaign fought during the Pacific Theatre of World War II. The campaign included a series of battles fought between July and November 1942 between Japanese and Australian forces in what was then the Australian territory of Papua. Following a landing near Ghana on the north coast of New Guinea on the night of the 21st of July 1942, Japanese forces attempted south overland through the mountains of the Owen Stanley Range to seize Port Moresby as part of a strategy of isolating Australia from the United States, ultimately causing Australia to possibly surrender due to lack of resources. Question 1. Why was Australia so unprepared? Until this point in the war, Australia was never under any real threat from any foreign power during its time of existence. When the Second World War had broken out, the main Australian fighting army and most of its military resources had been sent off to North Africa, leaving only a handful of troops to defend Australia, even with the impending threat of Japan. At this point, Australia had relied on Britain to defend them. Singapore was a heavily defended city, being a major trading port and also one of the centres for British control on the Asian continent. Australia had contributed to its garrison of around 85,000 troops, also having a fleet based at the port of Singapore. It seemed to be impenetrable. The British commander, with 85,000 troops, was fighting a siege against 36,000 Japanese. The Japanese at this point were at the point of breaking due to lack of supplies. The British fleet, consisting of 2 capital ships and 4 destroyers, sailed out to defend against an amphibious assault conducted by the Japanese. In the end, they were forced to retreat, with both capital ships sinking in the aftermath of the battle, allowing for Japanese troops to land unopposed. Soon after the Japanese had reached Singapore, the garrison of 85,000, consisting of reserves from places such as India and other colonial countries, had low morale and were not fit to fight. This was also the cause for the loss of Singapore. Though Japan would have been at the point of breaking if the commander did not surrender a day later. This caught Australia off by surprise. Ultimately, Australia lost an entire division of troops, taken high casualties, and lost much morale during the siege of Singapore. Before the expansion of a permanent defence force, Australia had no real military force before World War II. Before this, Australia had relied on being able to raise a large force in a short period of time. After the fall of Singapore, the Australian government and many Australians were worried that Japan would invade the Australian mainland. Australia was ill-prepared to counter such an attack, as the Air Force lacked modern aircraft and the Navy was too small and unbalanced to counter the Imperial Japanese Navy. Additionally, the army, although very large, contained many inexperienced units and lacked any way of reaching any place fast. In response to this threat, most of the Australian Imperial Force was brought back from North Africa, and the government asked the United States for assistance. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill attempted to send the 6th and 7th Divisions to Burma while they were travelling to Australia. But the Australian Prime Minister, John Curtin, did not allow this to happen. The perceived threat of the invasion led to a major expansion of the Australian military. By mid-1942, the army had the strength of 10 infantry divisions, 3 armoured divisions, and many other units. The Air Force and the Navy were also greatly expanded, though it took years for these services to build up to their peak strengths. In late July 1942, as the Japanese advanced towards the village of Kokoda, they were engaged by forward elements of the Papuan Infantry Battalion and the Australian 39th Infantry Battalion. Despite the Australian resistance, Kokoda fell to a larger Japanese force, and by the 27th of August, the Australian and Papuan forces who stayed with them had been forced back to Usurava. Reinforcements were sent from Port Moresby. First, the 53rd Battalion, which protected a sidetrack behind Usurava, and then the veteran 214th and 216th Battalions, which had previously served in North Africa. At Usurava, in the last days of August, the 39th and the 214 battalions, with support further back from the 216 and 53rd battalions, were able to hold the Japanese force during an intense 5-day action. By the end of the second battle, the Australians were in advance while the Japanese were forced to retreat. The Japanese had lost many soldiers and were now beginning to run out of supplies. The length of the track the Japanese advanced from had become too stretched, and the Japanese government decided that Kokoda was a failed operation. Many soldiers died of starvation, and many others resulted in cannibalism. In the end, of about 13,500 Japanese soldiers, only 5,000 Japanese soldiers were able to reach Buna and escape Papua New Guinea before they were captured. The rest were dead. None were captured. Australian casualties included 625 dead, 1,055 wounded in action, and 4,000 coming down from sickness such as malaria, though most of them survived. Australia had won a decisive victory. Until this point in the war, most countries had fallen to Japan with relative ease. This was the first land battle in which Japan had lost and had been forced to retreat, taking thousands of casualties with them. Port Moresby was a strategic location in the Pacific during World War II. If the Japanese would have been able to have taken it, Australia would have been surrounded, and the United States would not have been able to use Australia as a base. Australia would have been forced to surrender as well, and it's very likely that Japan would have overrun New Zealand, as their forces were still in Europe. The capture of Port Moresby would allow them to defend their gains and a link in conquering more land. Overall, Australia had won a massive, decisive victory against Japan. Japan would never be able to recover from this, as they had lost thousands of soldiers in a worthless campaign in which they could have won in the early months of the campaign. Japan from the rest of the war would be demoralized, as they slowly would be defeated by US and Australian forces as they pushed up north to Japan.